Those who are on the WebEx, give us just a few minutes. We are attempting to connect 2 legislative committee rooms, and so we are slowly but surely getting there. So give us just a few more minutes. Thank you. All right, actually, never mind. We're set up. All right. Yes, I see the other committee room on the monitor. Fantastic. Well, this will be interesting to see how this all works. So everybody, welcome to committee. I'm going to go ahead and get us started here. And basically, well, do they have the ability to hear us in the other committee room, by the way? Okay, just a few more seconds. Is there a way to turn up the volume in there? All right, so basically we're not going to be able to get the volume turned up in there just yet. Xavier. So it's probably gonna be a while before the volume gets turned up in there. Okay. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and try to get started here, and hopefully they will be able to hear in the other room. If not, I'm sure we'll hear about it. So with that, we have the Executive Director for the Governmental Ethics Commission, who's going to present a post-election update for us. But before we start that, I would like to go ahead and call on Representative Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Are we going to have bill introductions at some time today? Uh-oh. Does that mean I have to buy treats? Well, Mr. Chairman, I can think of no better day to provide treats to the committee than today. So if my office assistant would bring them forward, I can think of no better time than the moment to celebrate the birthday of our chairman.
Oh,
so if the rest of the committee will follow my lead, we will hijack the committee from the chair for just 2 minutes as we sing him happy birthday.
No.
And when we get to that line, the line is happy birthday, Mr. Chairman. And there's no. Happy birthday to you.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, Mr. Chairman. Happy birthday to you.
And I might amend that by saying it's a pretty big one for you today, so congratulations.
Yeah. Well, thank you, sir. I appreciate that, and got the best committee here in the Capitol. So thank you, guys.
And everybody needs to take a piece of this before they leave because it's a big cake, so appreciate it.
All right, so now with that, thank you again, Mr. Ranking Minority Member. Really appreciate that. So without further ado, Executive Director Skoglund, would you like to go ahead and kick us off if he's online?
Thank you very much. I'm hoping you're able to hear me. Is the volume okay? Great.
Let's go ahead.
Thanks very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here at the committee today. I always look forward to presenting the annual report, and today is no exception. I also was unaware that today was the chairperson's birthday. Tomorrow is mine, so if someone wants to give me a gift by passing some of our recommendations, I'm just saying that would be great. So today I'm going to go through our annual report, which essentially looks at a few things. It is a quick look at the activities of the Governmental Ethics Commission over fiscal year 20. Now, fiscal year 20 does not include the last election. Typically, election stats are in the annual report that follows. So next year's annual report will have quite a few election stats, though, of course, if you ever want some statistics on campaign finance, we produce some through our Twitter account, and you can always ask for some as well. For the annual report, I'm actually going to start out by skipping to page 6. where we first on the top half of that page, we're talking a little bit about education and public awareness. A large portion of what the Ethics Commission really works towards is providing trainings, making sure people are aware of the laws that they have to follow in order to avoid violations. Prevention and education are the primary goals of the agency. Now, in fiscal year 20, we actually were on approach to a very, very high number of presentations. We were reaching quite a few people. We had 13 presentations, but then it dropped off precipitously when the pandemic occurred. So all of those trainings occurred prior to the pandemic. However, we are working on some virtual trainings. New legislators have an orientation on Tuesday, those which I'm hoping you all, if there's any new legislators here, that I'm hoping you all have an opportunity to attend. And also I'm working on an all-state employee training, which it's a big lift, but if we can get all state employees to watch it, that would be the first time in Kansas history that every state employee would have an opportunity to be trained for their ethics obligations. On the bottom half of page 6 is our advisory opinions. Now, we provide advisory opinions for a number of reasons. Anyone who's subject to our laws can ask for one. We issued 4 advisory opinions in fiscal year 20. 3 of them were state conflict of interest issues, and 1 was local conflict of interest. It was an odd year that we didn't have a single campaign finance opinion. On page 7 is a brief discussion of campaign finance. Now, even though we consider it a non-election year, as usually the way we discuss it, obviously there are local candidates and everyone has to file that January 10th report. So on campaign finance, there were 1,377.
Hold on just 2 seconds real quick. I want to make sure everyone's tracking. Okay, has everybody been able to find their his testimony on their computers that wants to look at it? Unless you have it printed. Okay. Yes, it's under the, if you go to the Elections Committee, it is under the early testimony release documentation, and you can pull up his testimony from there and review it as he walks through it. So, all right, go ahead, Executive Director, sorry.
No, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. So on page 7 is where we were at with 1,377 receipts and expenditures reports that were filed in fiscal year 20. That included 517 state candidates, 1,070 county candidates, 242 city candidates, and 435 parties and PACs. For every one of those reports, it receives a comprehensive desk review. So every single line on those reports is not only being hand entered into a database, but it's being reviewed for compliance. On page 9 is a quick look at the conflict of interest statute, which is primarily enforced through financial disclosure statements, which are filed by a number of state employees and candidates through the year. 5,557 financial disclosure statements were filed in fiscal year 20, which is about on par with where it normally is, right in that mid 5,000 range. On page 10 is a quick look at the lobbying provisions. We also obviously have the authority to regulate lobbying, and there are 552 lobbyists that registered in calendar year 20. Now, this includes 1,644 organizations, because many lobbyists obviously represent more than one client. Of that, they've spent $770,000, which is a bit lower than what normally is expended in a year. That doesn't include expenditures that just was on the January report. But in general, that's a low number. And obviously that's probably largely due to the pandemic reducing the amount of lobbying interaction that was occurring. But to date, that included 7,752 lobbyist reports that were filed. And that, again, does not count this January report. I'll make the point here that there's any late filing of lobbyist reports is subject to civil penalties. And whether it's civil penalties or our lobbyist desk being amazing, because they are, but this January report, which is typically the hardest one to ensure compliance, there were 1,028 lobbyist reports that had to be filed, and we only had to send out 3 failure to file notices. That's a 99.7% compliance rate, which is truly something that, I mean, we keep breaking new records on compliance for lobbying every year. On page 11 is a quick look at our enforcement program. Obviously, we prioritize education and prevention whenever we can, but we do have to occasionally conduct investigations and file complaints, issue fines. In fiscal year 20, we had 30 investigations. This continues that trend of very high numbers of investigations. About 3 or 4 years ago, there was quite a long time when the number of investigations each year was around the single digits. And we've been around that 30 to 35 range for the last 3 years. There were 15 complaints actually filed in fiscal year 20. 7 of those were dismissed because there was insufficient evidence to support probable cause. 1 was dismissed after probable cause was found, but before a hearing was held, and 7 complaints had public hearings. Under civil penalties and fines, there at the bottom, civil penalties are automatically assessed for late filing of reports. The commission can always grant waivers or partial waivers for good cause shown, which happens a fair bit. The commission is pretty understanding of circumstances that can affect individuals. So we assessed $38,610 in civil penalties, but waived $10,680 of that in fiscal year 20. On the next page, there were 4 civil fine hearings, or there were 4 hearings that resulted in civil fines, and they amounted to $14,100 in fiscal year 20. These generally are, a lot of times these primarily are about people who did not file their reports and then ignored repeated attempts to contact them, sending them failure to files, notices, and they had at least 2 months in addition to that to file their report and just didn't. That actually was 2 of those 4 fines. Now, I can take any questions at this time. There's a couple of appendices with additional information, but the next and final part of the section of this presentation is about the legislative recommendations for the 2021 session. So I think now may be a good time to pause and see if there are any questions about the activities of the commission.
Director, do any representatives have any questions for the director? I know that I have one while we were waiting from feedback from our secondary room. With the individuals who just did not file their reports, they went 2+ months and were slapped with an exorbitant penalty here. I mean, was it just because they just didn't want to, or were they not getting the notices? I mean, can you shed some light on that whole situation for us?
Of course, yes. So when we send the initial failure to file notice, by statute, it is required to be sent through certified mail. So we have confirmation that they've received a failure to file. In addition, we send a number of other notices as well, including, in this case, it would be a complaint. Now, for a good idea of how long this takes, the initial failure to file is sent typically 1 or 2 days after the deadline. After that, the civil penalty will run, which takes about, I believe, 19 days to reach the maximum. Once it reaches the maximum or around that time, the commission determines whether or not they want to issue a complaint to try to work in another way to obtain compliance. That complaint process, the commission only meets once a month. After filing that complaint, the next month's meeting handles sufficiency. The month after that, it handles probable cause. The month after that is the public hearing. So there's quite a very long time with a number of attempts to contact these individuals long before we ever get to a civil fine approach. I'll tell you, in my experience, if someone is receiving a civil fine for failure to file a report, it is not because they didn't know that they had to. At that point, it's been several months, and they certainly were aware of their obligation. They just didn't.
Okay. Representative Proctor.
Mr. Chairman, I've got a quick question. what is the process inside your office, the decision-making process for whether a fine will be waived or not, or penalties will be waived or not?
That's a great question. So when a civil penalty is assessed, it by statute is automatically assessed. But anyone who is assessed a civil penalty can simply send in a writing to the commission asking them to waive the penalty. At the next commission meeting, the 9-member board will consider those possible waivers and make a determination and vote on whether or not to provide a waiver. Sometimes they will provide full waivers, sometimes none at all. Sometimes they will, for example, waive half of it if the rest is paid within 30 days, things like that. But there are certain factors that I've noticed do typically result in more generously considered waivers. For example, if a treasurer is having pretty severe medical issues, for example, that's a pretty common issue that has resulted in a number of civil penalty waivers being granted. So it really does depend, but the commission evaluates each one individually on its own merits.
Thank you.
All right, are there any further questions? Representative Bishop.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is there a continued evolution, shall we say, in expenditures being considered appropriate, legal, and so forth relative to social media, advertising, that sort of thing? Is that something that has now reached the point where it's pretty well set in concrete, or are things still evolving?
Sure. So I'll tell you that there are some of our laws that do not well consider social media. In fact, that's a great segue to one of our commission recommendations here in just a minute. But we've noticed that expenditures are typically permissible for people to post ads on social media. For all methods of posting ads on social media, other than when people are tweeting out messages, they just have to have that paid for attribution on it. But it certainly is a permissible campaign expense if someone wants to post ads for their campaign on social media.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Are there any further questions for the director at this time? All right, if you would like to go on to the next section, and if we have any other questions about that section, we'll come back to it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The next section is the Commission legislative recommendations for the 2021 session. Now, because the Commission considered that the pandemic may limit the session in certain ways, the recommendations this year are pared down to just 4, and I'm actually going to discuss a 5th at the end from the 2019 annual report. But the 4 recommendations that I'm going to talk about are primarily ones that are either items that were previously drafted into legislation and approved by this committee, or in one instance, a new recommendation. So the first item is mandatory electronic filing for state candidates. And I'll tell you that the biggest concern in the past for mandatory electronic filing has been that, frankly, no candidate should be prohibited from running for office just because they have a bad internet signal. If they simply cannot access broadband because they live in a particular rural area, they certainly should not be limited from office. And because of that concern, I believe it was this committee last year that added the amendment that the commission explicitly endorsed this year to allow for-cause waivers. So essentially, if someone does not have a good internet signal or simply doesn't have access to broadband, they just send some sort of message to the Ethics Commission asking for an exemption from the mandate to file electronically. And because that would be for cause, that would certainly be granted. So that to resolve this issue. But I'll tell you, when I tell you that every single line on every single report is hand entered into a database, I mean it. And so the next time you pull up a 300-page campaign finance report, I want you to have a moment of silence for my staff thinking about typing all of that in. But what really that causes is it causes a delay in the amount of time between when someone submits a report to when we can start reviewing those for accuracy. We have an October report that is filed in election years and then a January report. And I'll tell you, we simply cannot do any reviews of those October reports until after the January report has already been filed, which means that if there is an error on the October report, we won't catch it till a second report after the fact. And that's just because it takes so long to process this data. It also will reduce the number of errors and omissions notices when no candidate has ever looked at a piece of mail from the Ethics Commission and been excited that we sent them something. It's either a reminder or it could be that they've made an error, something that obviously no one is excited to get. So there are a number of issues that people encounter in campaign finance reporting that simply could be caught through errors and omissions notices. And we talked about this a bit in the hearing last year in this committee. But there are some items that simply are impossible to make errors of on an electronic filing report. And there are some items that could be caught with some improvements to the electronic filing system. So really, this makes life, frankly, a lot easier for candidates as well. But it also increases the accuracy of data presented to the public and reduce avenues for errors. And the reason why we're so concerned about this issue, not only is it a data entry issue for us and a processing, it's really just an efficiency error for our office, but also it's important to remember 40 other states already require this for all state candidates, and Kansas has required it for all statewide candidates for over a decade, and there really haven't been any issues on that front. So Kansas is now one of 10 states left that does not require this. And those numbers are from last year. With how fast states are adopting mandatory electronic filing, I wouldn't be surprised if one or two more have added since then. The second recommendation on the next page is disposal of campaign assets. Candidates are prohibited from using campaign contributions for personal use. This means they can't go buy, for example, they can't go buy an office chair and for their home. That certainly is not something they could do. Campaign contributions have to be expended for a legitimate campaign purpose or one of the other itemized reasons in the statute. But the problem occasionally arises where someone will purchase a phone, a laptop, or in rare instances, even a car, and then after the campaign is concluded, they try to keep that item personally. It is our view that that is a violation of the statute, but realistically, the statute needs some additional clarity to police the situation in abundantly clear form. For federal candidates, the FEC requires that this sort of equipment is sold off at fair market value and that money is returned to the campaign account. This is the approach that would be fairly easy and straightforward to handle, but we could follow the federal guidance on this in this particular area. This would assist the commission in allowing us to resolve issues like this a lot cleaner. The third item is actually just resolving a conflict that was created in the laws a few years ago. When civil penalties were increased for lobbyists and statement of substantial interest filers, or when they increased the civil penalty for lobbyists, it created a conflict in that the time period for when that civil penalty begins, the statute is not abundantly clear that it begins when the failure to file is sent, when it's put in the mail. That's the same that it is for all campaign finance filers as well. So every candidate, that civil penalty starts the moment we put it in the mail. And the reason for that is because lobbyists and candidates all know when their deadlines are, and they know that they have an obligation to meet that deadline. There's also an important timely issue that they have to file in time for people to have that information available. Now, the amended statute created a potential conflict that might imply that it's unclear whether that grace period begins from when the time that we can confirm receipt of that notice. And if that's the case, realistically, there would be no civil penalties assessed for anyone. Lobbyists could avoid the service of the certified mail, so we could never confirm that the failure to file was ever received by them, or we all know that the Postal Service has had substantial delays as well. So it would take months at times before we could even confirm that they've received the failure to file. And at that time, there are 2 more reports the lobbyists still owed. So it's an easy resolution, and we view this as just a a cleanup of a conflict that occurred in statute to ensure that it's clear that civil penalties begin running from the date that the failure to file is sent. The last item goes back to the representative's question just a few minutes ago on number 4, the social media attribution. There are times, the statute requires that when electronic communication exists that includes express advocacy, a paid-for attribution has to appear at the end of the item. Now, on Facebook pages, for one particularly good example, there is no end to the item. That page just scrolls backward in chronological order forever. So because of that, it's questionable whether or not compliance is even possible on a page like that. This is something that can be easily resolved by just simply updating the statute. Some states that have approached it in this form have used the clear and conspicuous language so that essentially a paid-for attribution doesn't need to rigidly appear at the end of electronic communication. It just has to appear in a clear and conspicuous location. This is a pretty simple update in the Commission's view, but I think last year's legislation on this included eliminating the treasurer from paid-for attribution. The Commission doesn't explicitly recommend it, but it doesn't oppose it either. It really doesn't have an issue with that. The last item is actually the other document, and I apologize to the individual who is helping me out with the screen share here, that this is a separate document. But in the 2019 report, we had a recommendation regarding coordination with federal investigations. So investigations undertaken by the Commission are confidential, and it's critically important that they remain so, not just because of the integrity of the investigation itself, but also because someone being merely accused of a violation of the ethics or campaign finance laws should not be sufficient to drag someone's name through the mud. If someone is going to be publicized as someone who has violated these laws, at a minimum, there certainly should be a finding of probable cause before that could possibly occur. And that's the standard that the Commission has held to since its inception. Now, there are times when investigations, however, require the assistance of another state agency. For example, there are times when, let's say we were investigating a bank regulator. We may need the Office of the State Bank Commissioner to explain an area of the law that we've never really had to engage with. So we could essentially use those state employees to help us in that way. Unfortunately, the law, when it was drafted, almost certainly with an oversight, did not include federal employees as well. It's probably just that no one thought about it at the time, whether or not the Ethics Commission would ever need to have discussions with FBI agents or the FEC. And this doesn't happen that much, but when it does, I will say it is a rather sizable hindrance to the ability to resolve issues. Now, the other portion of this too is if I, for example, were subject to a federal subpoena, it puts me or my staff in a particularly difficult position. If I were subpoenaed by a federal in a federal trial, I'm either required to violate the state confidentiality statute and risk not just losing my job, but also a fine of up to $5,000, or my other option would be to be held in contempt and placed in jail. Certainly not a position that anyone should have to be in, and it's really only this way because of the precise language in the confidentiality statute that we think probably could be pretty simply resolved. This was not actually introduced last year. We think that it's just a couple of words that are added to two statutes, and in our view, this is probably an unintended consequence of the way the legislation was drafted originally years ago. So. That's the last recommendation that I'm going to talk about today. But if anyone has any questions, I'd be certainly happy to take them.
Anyone have any questions for the director? Representative Dodson.
I apologize. If someone is speaking, I can't hear them.
Okay, I just pressed it again. Can you hear me now?
Yep. Yes, I can. Thank you.
I have the clear blue light.
Yes,
when
I
you
can
were
hear you.
talking about the workload for your staff, is that regarding just the handwritten variety, or does this have to do with the electronic variety?
Right. So right now, regardless of how it's submitted, every single line is being hand entered into a database. But if most reports are submitted electronically, then we can work with the Secretary of State's office to just simply acquire all of the data in what essentially looks like a massive Excel spreadsheet and drop it into our database, which means that essentially 2 months worth of data entry work is done in about 15 seconds.
So there's no underlying weakness in the software support like we've had in some other systems?
All of the information is publicly available on campaign finance reports, so we're not concerned about like a cybersecurity issue here, for example. But we haven't, while we are currently updating our database because it is very old, for the moment it still works for our systems. And certainly our discussions with the Secretary of State's office a few years ago on this point indicated that the data we could receive would be not difficult to adjust to any database.
Just a quick point on forms. When we had, let's say there are 3 kinds of things you have to go through: the appointment of a treasurer, the statement of substantial interest, and the filing. It wasn't really clear to me when I filed those latter 2 documents of the date that I was supposed to use for the appointment of treasurer. I had in fact selected a treasurer much earlier. So when you start collecting funds, obviously you're supposed to have those other documents in already. So can you walk through that a little bit to make sure that I understand how that's supposed to work?
Sure,
I got
absolutely.
a nice note back from your office, by the way, to explain it, but it wasn't clear on the form.
I'm very lucky to have the staff that I do, so I will certainly pass on your nice words to them. When a campaign is just beginning, when someone becomes a candidate, they have 10 days to choose a treasurer and then 10 days to appoint the treasurer. So they have essentially this 20-day window. However, they can't accept or expend campaign funds until they've actually filed that appointment of treasurer form. Also, we'll send if someone has become a candidate and has not filed as a candidate yet, they haven't appointed a treasurer, we would send you a failure to file that just reminds you have to do this. And appointment of treasurer forms have a 15-day grace period, so there's quite a bit of time for you to receive the form, understand it, and also my staff often calls people as well if we know that someone is a candidate. They're getting close to potentially receiving a civil penalty for not appointing a treasurer. We really don't like assigning civil penalties for appointment of treasurer forms because appointing a treasurer is fairly simple. You can always appoint yourself as treasurer, which is what a lot of people do. And so we try to really make sure we work with those newer candidates in particular to ensure that they are aware of those requirements.
We were talking about having the treasurer on social media ads. Just to clarify, today people put things on Facebook, they put things on or on Twitter rather, that are essentially ads in nature. In other words, they are meant to influence those who receive those messages from you. This is particularly true at the national level. My assumption is, unless it's a specific campaign ad, that the addition of the word treasurer and so on is not required. Is that correct?
I very much appreciate this question because no matter how many times I get the opportunity to talk about paid for attributions, there's always really good opportunities to help people understand them better. In most communications, if an item has, typically we're talking about flyers, drop cards, or electronic communication, if it uses express advocacy, so if it says vote for, donate to, defeat this person, anything like that that is express advocacy, paid for attribution is required on that item. And all paid for attribution today under current law requires not just the individual candidate's name, but also the treasurer's name as well. I will say, though, that you did mention Twitter. Twitter has a specific exemption, and the reason why is because the character limit reasonably limits the amount of room someone has. So for example, if someone fills up 280 characters with a message of express advocacy, there's no room left for a paid for attribution. Now on Facebook, people can post as long of a post as they want, and they can either put the way that we've been enforcing it, though, like our fourth recommendation says, this is a little questionable. Paid for attribution can either appear just on that post or clearly demarcated on that particular Facebook page. And as long as that's the case, we assume that the paid for attribution has been met. But any electronic communication or any printed communication that includes express advocacy needs to have a paid for attribution on it if it comes from the campaign. Now, there's a lot of other components of this too, whether it's paid periodicals, paid newspaper ads, robocalls, things like that, that have different parts of the statute. I'm always happy to talk with people about making sure they understand paid for attribution. That's what we get more questions on than anything else during the session, for sure, or during the campaign season.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for the questions.
Representative Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is on Facebook like that, say it's a post, not a paid ad, you know, just a free post on Facebook. Does that require a paid for? Because it's not really paid for. So
correct. So if the electronic communication is made by the candidate or an agent of the candidate, then yes, same goes with parties as well. Then it doesn't matter if it was something that was paid for or if it was a free communication. All electronic communication that originates from a candidate or a party that is viewed by more than 15 people has to have a paid for on the item. Now on Facebook, means that a candidate posting, I hope you go out and vote for me, you should have put a paid for on that item. But realistically, this is a good example of why the commission provides first-time waivers for paid for violations, because scenarios like this, feels like you shouldn't need a paid for on an item that wasn't paid. But even though paid for is always adequate, you can always substitute sponsored by if you'd rather.
All right. Thank you very much.
Representative Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Director, that segues into exactly what I was going to ask. It sounded, based on your last couple of sentences, that there's something somewhere that says something needs to say paid for even when it's free. Is that in statute, or is there a opinion from the commission? Where does that idea originate? Because I think that's kind of silly when you do something that doesn't cost, that you have to tell people who, quote, paid for it.
Sure, no, that's a great question. So it's worth remembering that paid for is kind of nomenclature for a type of attribution that just appears on posts. It's just a disclaimer saying this is who originated this. A lot of people, especially for free communication, use sponsored by instead, and both statute and regulation allow either paid for or sponsored by to be used interchangeably. It's always fine to use one or the other. A lot of people prefer sponsored by on the free communication just because that's really where you typically run into that language. Now, there are times when free communication does not require paid for attribution. For example, a news article or posting in the news somewhere, if there's volunteers making calls, then it's not paid because no one is paying for that service. There are scenarios where it has to be paid, and it depends on which subsection the communication falls under. But most campaign communication that we end up talking about in this area is printed communication, which always requires paid or sponsored by on the bottom of the item if it includes express advocacy, or electronic communication, which always requires paid for or sponsored by if it originates from the candidate or the or party or PAC. As long as that's the case, and the communication includes express advocacy, then paid by or sponsored by is required. But again, this is really, the phrase paid for is less about the fact that payment has occurred and really just about disclosing who has originated the ad.
And directly to my question, I take it that that's statutory.
That is correct.
You don't have to do it at the moment, but can you follow up on the citation of that statute, please?
Yep.
And
Not a problem
lastly,
at all.
Mr. Chairman, on a different subject, if I may, Mr. Director, you mentioned the difficulty of responding during that time frame for both the October reports and the January reports. The significance of promptness of those reports diminishes dramatically when the election's already over. Would it be any benefit to you if the deadline for filing the December 31 report was extended so you weren't having to jump right on those?
Sure. So actually, that's already built into statute. The October report has a 2-day grace period because obviously there's the general election and primary election reports are critically important. They are timely. People might want to be seeing those during an election period. The January report has a 15-day grace period. It's much longer and by design has a lower civil penalty for enforcement. I think that that's designed very well to respond to part of this issue. But no, I think that the January 10th report for all filers works very well, the current schedule.
Because I know those October reports give you very little time to lie about what's in them, so I understand that.
All right, Representative Parker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Skoglund, I was wondering, just to take you further into the weeds on the paid for by attribution, there was a what seemed like pretty significant ruling by the Ethics Commission in regard to text messages for campaigns. I wondered if you could unpack that a little bit. And then on that note, something you said before kind of caught my attention, which was if the communication originates from the candidate. So in regards to text messages, would a volunteer without using a paid text service just on their own phone texting, would the paid for limitations also apply to them?
I'm glad to have that question because we just issued that opinion very recently. We determined that text communication is subject to the paid for requirements. So if if a text blast is sent out that includes express advocacy, encouraging people to vote for a clearly identified candidate or against a clearly identified candidate, or asking for donations, anything like that, then a paid for attribution would be required. However, this is considered telephonic communication. And I know that that's a little in the weeds because obviously iMessage is an open question about whether or not that's technically telephonic. But the way that the commission chose to handle text messages is as telephonic communication. As long as it's telephonic, this means that if it is a free communication, so if it's just volunteers on their phone text banking, then that is not a paid item. There's no need for a paid for attribution. So that's the particular statutory subsection that was applied for text messages. So paid for is required for text messages if it includes express advocacy and if it is a paid item.
So, Mr. Chair, if you don't mind, just to clarify, if a campaign was using a peer-to-peer text app, that ultimately sends a telephonic communication, but they had to purchase that app, or they have to pay by the text message or the phone number that they import into that. All of those communications would fall within the requirement of the paid for by, correct?
Yes, any sort of text blast like that, if it's paid, requires a paid for at the beginning of the message because we approach it as telephonic communication.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Lee Hahn.
So much for your testimony today. I'm a little confused as to the social media piece of this. Does that mean that every post on a candidate's page would have to say paid for by, or just the vote for me posts?
The way we've been approaching it is that either is fine. Either a paid for attribution on the page in general, as long as it's in an obvious place, is acceptable, or people can put it on all of the individual posts. That's fine as well. This actually is part of why that number 4 is sort of the cleanup provision, because number 4 is more or less the actual enforcement of the commission right now anyway. But however, if someone walked in our door with a complaint saying this person put the paid for on their Facebook page in the about section instead of at the end of the page, technically they're right. That is not what the statute requires. And the commission would probably be required to, at least at a minimum, consider whether or not probable cause exists for that item. Even though it's probably not very reasonable and it's not the actual practice of the commission.
So does that apply then to elected officials as well, or just when candidates are running?
It applies to candidates, elected officials, anyone who is subject to the Campaign Finance Act, but only on messages that include express advocacy or on pages that include express advocacy. So, for example, if your personal Facebook page or if you have a group that is about your office holding, for example, it has nothing to do with your candidacy. You never tell people to vote for people there. You never ask for donations. As long as that's the case, you would never need a paid for on that page. However, you would need it on any Facebook page where you are asking for votes or encouraging to defeat particular candidates, things like that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Proctor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Director, I got a question. I'm going to try to generalize it, but about county state parties. There was a brouhaha this last election cycle about some of the county parties or the state parties purchasing materials that contain the name of a national candidate. And the question came up about whether that constitutes supporting that candidate. Do you feel like that statute is clear, or do you feel like there's some additional clarity required as to whether that means monetary or advocacy?
I appreciate that question. The statute is it's limited in its verbiage, which means that it's actually pretty clear in what it requires. Any and all campaign funds that are collected and reported under the Kansas Campaign Finance Act, so all candidates, all PACs, all parties, that money cannot be used in or for the campaign of a candidate for federal elective office. So none of that money can ever be spent to support a federal candidate in any way. Now, that said, I think that this last election cycle confronted some issues, and we worked in those scenarios to resolve them in ways that worked on an education and prevention stance, because that's normally our approach. And in future, we have plans for improving that communication early on when we have a federal electoral cycle.
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry if I could just, this is kind of another burning issue, to go back to your discussion about Facebook and Facebook pages and posts and the revision that you would like us to make in this recommendation number 4. Are you concerned at all that technology is going to outrun this statute? I mean, Facebook tomorrow could do away with groups or do away with pages or change the format in a way that makes that obsolescent. Is there danger or any second or third order effects of trying to chase the technology with statutes?
I love that question, because the reason why we're in the position we are with Facebook right now is because the statute didn't think forward about future kinds of communication. I'm not going to say that every statute is going to be perfect, and I agree chasing tech is going to always be problematic in that way. But the language of clear and conspicuous means that if tomorrow all of a sudden everyone adopted a social media network that operated through virtual reality, and all ads appeared in some other very odd form, as long as the paid for attribution is clear and conspicuous, we can pass a simple regulation for it, or perhaps clear and conspicuous is clear enough on its own merits. So I'm not going to say it future-proofs the statute as a guarantee, but it certainly future-proofs it better than the current language does. But that's exactly how we got here, so I appreciate that.
Thank you.
The representative have Representative Miller.
Mr. Scoglin, I appreciate your one of your first comments where you indicated that your annual report is only through the fiscal year, and consequently, we only have briefs of opinions looking through April of 2020. However, you just mentioned at least one recent opinion that sounds very pertinent to current conversations. Is there a way to get a one-paragraph summary of opinions that have been issued subsequent to the end of the fiscal year, so we are looking extemporaneously at what we need to be focusing on this session? There aren't that many, are there?
No, there are not very many, but I'd be happy to provide those for you. Not everyone wants to wait until the next annual report to see what our opinions have held. Obviously, we do publish those opinions both through our website, through the Kansas Register, and we often will tweet the actual text as well of the
except that I spend my spare time watching football, not going through your website. So when I'm in this room, I'm not doing my fantasy stats. I'm focused on this subject. Thank you.
I'm happy to provide that paragraph summary. Not a problem at all.
Representative Lee Hahn.
Yes, my question is, to me, this seems, it's going back to social media, it seems a bit redundant. If a post comes from a candidate's personal Facebook page, and every single post they have to put paid for by, but it comes from their personal paid for, or their personal Facebook page, and they have to have admins that they set, moderators that they set, is that redundant to have that caveat every time versus a mailer, which is, of course, anybody could have sent that on behalf of the candidate, not just the candidate themselves?
Right. So typically, I'll tell you that I have to, during campaign seasons, I probably have to review several dozen Facebook pages that people are concerned about, or just simply, more commonly, people just didn't know the paid for requirements. Out of all of those, I'd say probably 95 to 98% of those just put one paid for attribution somewhere on the page, usually in the about section. Or in the bio of that page, and that handles it for all of the posts. Very, very few people put it on each individual post. When that happens, I know there's a couple of county candidates that do that, and that's typically where I see that. Often county sheriff races, I think, is where I see it more than anything else. But most people will just have the one paid for attribution for the whole page. Now, theoretically, under current law, it needs to happen at the end of the page, but all this recommended change would just require it to be clear and conspicuous. It wouldn't matter where it is, as long as it's readily apparent.
Thank you so much.
All right, so I got a question for you. I'm going to shift gears on you a little bit. So back to non-compliance with filing of campaign finance reports. In the past, you've given us updates on how many people fail to file on time, and because this is a relatively new statute, I believe 2018 or so. And so since then, since that law has been in place, have we continued to see non-compliance go down and more compliance go up?
Anecdotally, yes, and I think we're at a point when we have not had obviously identical periods, because obviously the Senate has only come up once since then, and we have had a couple of House electoral periods. I do have enough data at this point that there is something that is shareable in this area. I'd be happy to put that together for the committee, because honestly, I think it's interesting. Obviously, at the beginning, you're actually going to see a jump in some civil penalty assessments because we shortened the grace period as well. But the old grace period, like was discussed at the time of that hearing in the, I think, 2018 session, was completely unworkable. It was a 15-day grace period for primary and general election reports, which meant someone could just choose not to file until on day 14 after the election occurs and not receive a penalty. So shortening that grace period means more people get failure to files at the outset, but we are continuing to see compliance improve, and at least anecdotally, and I'm sure the numbers will back that up as well. But I'm interested in putting that together for the committee if they're interested.
Yes, if you could please, and provide that to the committee assistant, Dana. Thank you. this last election cycle, how many people filed, do you know how many people filed electronically versus with paper? And could you even read the people's handwriting when they did theirs by paper?
So I'm actually going to address the second question first, mostly because I think it's funny. We do have some terrible handwriting that occasionally comes in campaign finance reports. We don't send out a lot of errors and omissions notices for illegibility, but we do have the ability to do it. I'll tell you that bad handwriting is does come up a fair bit, but the bigger problem, honestly, there is when people submit Excel spreadsheets that are about size 2 font. We always have a dozen or so every year that we have to send back and ask them to resubmit, which isn't a big deal. They just didn't think about it when they submitted it. It just formatted their page oddly. But in terms of the number of people who filed electronically, I can get the numbers for all candidates if you'd like, but I know the numbers for the current membership of the legislature. In the Senate, 29 people filed electronically and 11 filed in other forms. In the House, 86 filed electronically and 39 filed in other methods.
So if my understanding, or if my memory serves me correctly, that's actually a vast increase in House members that are submitting theirs via electronically, correct?
That is correct.
Are there any further questions from members of the Elections Committee? Or anything that has been discussed today? I'm giving the other room enough time. Okay, I'm not getting any text messages or anything like that. So with that, thank you, Director Skoglund. We appreciate your time. If you have any questions or concerns for us going forward, please let us know. I'm sure many of the committee members would be more than happy to work with you. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we will go ahead and conclude today's committee hearing. Representative
Thank you very, very much for the opportunity and for your time.
Yes, sir. Yes, Representative Miller, I will reopen the hearing and ask for bill introductions.
And actually, I don't have any bill introductions, but my question relates directly to bill introductions, and that is the ones we just looked at. Is there a plan for when we consider whether or not to introduce the recommendations of Mr. Skoglund's commission?
Historically, in the past, as vice chair, I served with you previously as vice chair. What we've done is went ahead and drafted those bills and had them introduced into committee. So if that is agreeable to the committee, we will go ahead and have the recommendations drafted. And as time permits, we will work those recommendations and as we figure out the schedule going forward.
And a final reminder, get a piece of cake.
Yes, everybody come and get a piece of cake. I don't want to gain 20 pounds over here. Thank you so very much, Representative Miller, for the cake. That is a very kind gesture of you. All right, that is a very kind gesture of you, sir. Thank you. All right, that concludes today's committee. Committee adjourned.